They say some storms pass through a landscape only to leave silence behind. But the storm that found a young Bulgarian girl in 1923 did something far stranger. It stripped away her sight and opened something else. As the dust settled and the villagers found her half buried beneath the earth, she trembled, blind, frightened, but changed. She whispered later that when the light left her eyes, another kind of light entered, a quiet one, a merciless one, a light that showed her things no human should ever have to see. Her name was Baba Vanga, and long before the world knew her, long before presidents and scientists crossed oceans just to sit in her dimly lit home, she spoke of visions that would shape the fate of continents. She described them not as predictions, not as guesses, but as things already written in some hidden layer of time, waiting to unveil themselves like pages in a forgotten manuscript. Some believe the world ignored her until it was too late. Others say the world listened, just not carefully enough. She foresaw iron birds cutting through American skies. Iron birds. She called them long before commercial jets were ever weaponized. And when the towers in New York fell, many returned to her words. Chilled by how plainly she had described devastation that still haunts a generation, she spoke of a roaring wave swallowing coastlines decades before the 2004 tsunami erased entire worlds in a single afternoon. She mentioned a dark banner rising in the Middle East, a force wrapped in fire and fanaticism, years before ISIS carved its name into global fear. And she uttered a phrase few understood at the time: a man of color will take the highest seat in the land of the eagle. When Barack Obama stepped into office, those words resurfaced like a ghost come home. But these were only fragments, scattered sparks compared to what she said about America's greatest unraveling. Compared to what she warned about a man who would come from the world of gold, not politics, and reshape the nation in ways no one could stop, no matter how fiercely they tried. She warned of a leader who would rise against every expectation, against every prediction, against the very machinery designed to prevent outsiders from seizing power. A man born of commerce, wealth, spectacle, a man who walked in gilded halls, not marble government corridors, a man destined to divide the country not because he sought division, but because the country was already cracked beneath its surface. Think about this. When she spoke those words, Donald Trump was not a political figure. He was a builder, a name on skyscrapers, a host on television. Yet she described him not just his rise, but the chaos that would surround him with an accuracy that today feels almost surgical. She foresaw investigations, trials, legal storms that would chase him like wolves through darkened courts. She foresaw enemies emerging not from foreign lands, but from within his own circle. She foresaw the attempt to erase him through systems built to break men from the inside out. And she foresaw, above all else, that he would survive it. She said the man of gold would endure. When Trump appeared on the political stage, every expert, every commentator, every voice that claimed to understand the patterns of American history dismissed him. Yet he won. And when those legal storms she warned of finally gathered indictments, impeachments, investigations, they came with a ferocity that would have broken any other figure in modern politics. Yet he rose again and again, bruised but unbowed, echoing her prophecy in real time. But what startled her followers most was not that she foresaw his rise. It was that she foresaw his return. She said he would fall, yes, that he would be pushed into a kind of exile, not necessarily a physical one, but something colder, something meant to isolate him from power. But she also said the exile would end, and the moment of return would mark the beginning of America's greatest trial, a moment when the nation would face decisions that would determine whether it remained whole, or broke apart under the weight of its own unresolved history. She foresaw 2026, a year she described as a hint point, a fault line between what America was and what it would become. She spoke of it with fear, not because she doubted the nation's strength, but because she had seen the consequences of ignoring warnings written in the fabric of time. She described 2026 as a year of storms, political, natural, spiritual. A year when the eagle would struggle to lift its wings, burdened by contradictions no one wanted to acknowledge. And she placed the man of gold at the center of it. Many believe she wasn't speaking about politics. They believe she was speaking about the soul of a country caught between two identities, two futures, two versions of itself. And whether Trump rises or falls is not the real prophecy. The real prophecy, they say, is about what America becomes because of him. Before we go deeper into that, pause for a moment and consider something. If everything she foresaw about him has unfolded with terrifying precision, what does that mean for what comes next? What does it mean for a nation she warned would fracture, for an economy she said would tremble, for a world she said would stand at the edge of something vast, dark, and irreversible? Because her vision did not end with a man, it began with him. And what follows is everything she feared humanity would not be ready to face. She foresaw a nation splitting long before its people ever felt the first tear beneath their feet. She spoke of a division not drawn by borders or armies, but by belief, by identity, by a slow unraveling of trust so quiet that most wouldn't notice until it was already too late. And at the center of that unraveling stood the man she described as the one from the world of gold. Some say she meant wealth. Some say she meant the towers that gleamed under Manhattan's sun. Others believe she meant something deeper, an age of gold, gilded on the outside and hollow beneath, a symbol of a country that had grown bright, powerful, and restless all at once. But whatever she meant, it was clear that her golden man matched a figure who would not walk into history quietly. She foresaw him as someone who would cross thresholds he was never supposed to cross, break norms that were meant to be unbreakable, and challenge every structure built to control leadership. She warned that those structures would turn against him with a fury that came from fear, not justice. She saw him walking into courts, surrounded by enemies wearing the faces of allies. She saw trials wrapping around him like vines, endless, choking, relentless, and she saw him enduring all of it, not victorious, but unbroken. Look around at what has already unfolded. Investigations stretched over years, legal battles multiplying like storms across a continent, attempts to silence him through the machinery of institutions rather than the judgment of voters. Every accusation, every indictment, every dramatic moment flashed across screens, each one echoing the pattern she described decades before his name ever appeared on a ballot. It's chilling to think of how closely the real world has followed the script she left behind. But she said something else, something far more unsettling. She foresaw his return. She said the man of gold would fall into shadow, a time of exile. She called it, not necessarily a banishment, but a season stripped of power, a period of forced distance from the centers of influence. A moment engineered by those who feared his second rise more than they feared his first. Yet she said that exile would not last. She warned that the return would arrive during a moment of deep American confusion, when the nation would feel as if it were standing on fractured glass. And she tied that return to a specific year, 2026 for her. It wasn't just a date, it was the hinge of an era, a pressure point where America's unresolved tensions would collide. A year when the cracks she had spoken of would widen into something larger, what she called the Great Fracturing. She didn't describe it in political terms. She described it like an earthquake, a shaking from within, a split that begins invisibly, underground, until one day the ground simply gives way. Brothers against brothers, cities against their nation. The eagle turns its wings inward. It's hard to ignore the parallels. Political tension rising like heat beneath a sealed lid. Neighbors no longer trusting neighbors. Protests growing more polarizing. States resisting federal directives. The idea of a unified identity dissolving at the edges, and the world watching, aware that when America trembles, the entire global order shakes with it. She said the fracture would not begin with violence. It would begin with defiance, with regions refusing to comply, with leaders challenging authority in ways that once seemed unthinkable. She described governors standing like pillars resisting the pull of Washington. She saw citizens rallying behind movements that rejected the old structures entirely. And she saw the man of gold standing not as the cause, but as the catalyst, an accelerant poured onto fault lines already buried beneath decades of political pressure. Think about the headlines today. States openly opposing federal policies. Lawsuits between governments of the same nation. Talk of secession whispered louder each year. A nation no longer split between left and right, but between two incompatible visions of what America should be. She warned that the return of the man of gold would amplify that split, not because he sought it, but because his presence would force the country to confront everything it had avoided for too long. And while the political fracture deepened, she said the economy would begin to crumble under its own weight. The tower of paper will bend, she warned, a striking image for a nation built on debt more than assets. She saw the dollar weakening. She foresaw alliances shifting away from America, drifting toward new centers of power rising in the East. She spoke of trade collapsing, of markets losing faith, of an economic tremor that would ripple outward until the world realized the old system had finally reached its breaking point. Look at the signs today. National debt spiraling beyond historical precedent. Inflation eating through savings. Global trust in the dollar eroding as BRICS gathers momentum. Former allies hedging their bets. A world quietly preparing for a future where America is no longer the sun around which all other planets orbit. Everything she described is unfolding not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, undeniable transition. But the fracture was not the end. It was the beginning. She warned that the man of gold would shape the storm simply by existing inside it. She saw him attacked from every angle, betrayed by those closest to him, yet still holding a thread of influence strong enough to pull nations into alignment or misalignment. She said he would become the center of a storm, not of his own making, but of America's hidden wounds, rising to the surface. And what terrified her was not the man himself, but the reaction to him. She warned that his return in 2026 would push America into a confrontation with its own reflection. A moment when it could no longer pretend to be united. A moment when two Americas would stand faced. One America built on control, surveillance, and obedience. The other built on rebellion, spirit, and awakening. A split not yet physical, but spiritual and irreversible divergence of identity. Before we move deeper, pause and ask yourself, do you feel that divide already? Do you sense two different nations living inside the same borders? Do you hear the crack beneath your feet? Because if Baba Vanga was right, the fracture is only the first tremor. What comes next is far more violent, and far harder to ignore. She foresaw storms that did not come from weather. She foresaw tremors that did not rise from fault lines. She foresaw fires that did not begin with human hands. And she said all of it would unfold in the same era when humanity would create minds that think, minds that mimic, minds that one day might rise beyond the grasp of their makers. When she spoke these words, the world barely understood electricity. Yet somehow, she described a landscape that looks uncannily like the one we stand in today. Baba Vanga said the earth itself would rebel, not as punishment, not as divine wrath, but as a warning. She said that when humankind strayed too far from balance, too far from humility, the ground, the sky, and the waters would respond. Fire from the heavens, she whispered. Storms that have no memory in the past. Quakes in places where the earth has slept for centuries. Think about this. Look at the fires now, swallowing entire towns. Fires born from heat so severe that forests erupt like kindling. Look at the hurricanes that tear across coastlines with a violence no generation before us has seen. Look at the earthquakes emerging in regions once considered stable. Look at the atmospheric rivers, the polar vortexes, the shifting jet streams. Look at the sky when solar storms brush against our magnetic field, threatening the networks we rely on but no longer understand. Whether you believe her words literally or symbolically, the pattern is impossible to ignore. She said 2026 would mark a convergence, a turning point when natural disasters would no longer feel random but rhythmic. Synchronized like beats in a drum sequence, the earth has waited too long to play. She warned that the signs would come faster, closer, louder, that humanity's illusion of control would begin to dissolve as nature stepped forward to reclaim its authority. And she spoke of something darker still, a fire descending from above that would ignite fear unlike anything modern civilization has endured. Some interpret fire from the sky as meteors after all. The earth is entering periods of heightened celestial activity. Some believe she saw the flares of the sun, bursts of solar fury strong enough to disrupt power grids and blind satellites in orbit. Others see echoes of wildfires caused by lightning storms so intense they resemble bombardment. And a few believe she glimpsed something more catastrophic. Energy systems failing, exploding, igniting across landscapes built on fragile infrastructure. But for Vanga, fire from the sky wasn't the only threat. She warned of something more artificial, something made by human ambition. She spoke of the rise of minds of metal, thinking machines that would slip their chains when the world needed stability most. To her, the crisis wasn't that machines would become violent, it was that humans would become dependent. Dependent on systems they didn't understand. Dependent on algorithms that made decisions without conscience. Dependent on structures that appeared neutral but carried the weight of entire civilizations. And look at us now. Algorithms decide which wars we see on the news. They influence elections, manipulate markets, write code that builds the very world we live in. Machines predict human behavior with frightening accuracy. They compose music, diagnose illness, target enemies in military operations, and translate the thoughts of millions into data points on a server farm buried beneath the desert. They've become the invisible architecture of society. She foresaw this long before the first computer blinked to life. She said that around 2026, humanity would face its first true crisis of the mind, a moment when we realize the systems that run the world have grown too complex for human oversight. She said decisions would be made without human understanding. Risks would evolve faster than regulations, and people would awaken to the terrifying truth that they had surrendered too much, too quickly, to something they assumed they controlled. It's chilling to consider how close we are to that line. AI writes laws. AI creates propaganda. AI predicts stock market movements. AI chooses which voices rise and which voices vanish into digital silence. And yet, most people don't see the danger. They see convenience, efficiency, power, just as she warned. But Vanga said something else, something most people overlook. She said the crisis of thinking machines would collide with the crisis of the earth, and the collision would shake the world in ways no prophecy had fully captured. In her visions, she saw storms knocking out power grids built by automated systems. She saw AI misinterpreting environmental data, triggering decisions that worsen crises. Instead of solving them, she saw infrastructures collapsing because their human caretakers had forgotten how to operate them manually. A world built on automation failing in the same moment nature decides to strike. Think about the implications. Think about the vulnerabilities. Think about what we've already seen. Airports shut down by software glitches, financial markets halted by algorithmic loops, power grids threatened by solar flares. Each event small, contained, but each one revealing how thin the line of control truly is. And she tied it all back to the man of gold, not in a mystical way, but in a symbolic one. She said that as he rose once more, the systems around him would reveal their fragility. The world would turn chaotic, and the structures humanity trusted most would begin to shake. But this was not the full extent of her warning. She said the fire and the machines were only precursors, signals, harbingers of something much larger brewing in the geopolitical shadows. She saw tensions stretching from east to west like a taut rope pulled tight enough to snap. She saw nations rising, alliances shifting, old powers weakening. She described the year when every unresolved global conflict would flare at once, and she placed that year on the same timeline as the storms, the fires, the machines. 2026. Before we step into that prophecy, take a breath and ask yourself, does it feel as though separate crises are beginning to align? Do you sense the rhythm beneath the chaos? Do you see the pattern forming across nations, economies, skies? Because if she was right, what comes next is not merely chaos, it is convergence. She said the world would reach a moment when truth could no longer stay buried, a moment when the weight of secrets, political, financial, spiritual, would grow too heavy for the world to carry in silence. And that moment, she warned, would not arrive gently. It would break open like a fault line running through every institution humanity once trusted. She called it the Great Revelation, a time when what was hidden would be forced into the light, not by the powerful, but by those living in the shadows of their decisions. She foresaw documents surfacing, files long locked behind metal doors, sealed in vaults, removed from public eyes for decades. She spoke of whistleblowers emerging, not singly, but in waves, each voice carrying a fragment of the truth. Some saw this as a metaphor, others took it literally. But however one reads it, the pattern is undeniable. Every year, more leaks, more revelations, more anonymous disclosures, more cracks in the structures built to guard the secrets of governments and corporations. And she warned that these revelations would collide with a moment of political upheaval inside America itself. She described a scene that feels eerily familiar, a country questioning its own foundations, tearing apart narratives once seen as unshakable. She said trust would collapse not because of lies but because the truth, once revealed, would be too enormous to ignore. It wasn't just corruption she spoke of. It wasn't just manipulation or hidden agendas. She warned of something deeper, a spiritual deception woven into society, so subtle that most people would sense something was wrong without knowing what to call it. The mirror will crack, she said, and the reflection will frighten even the ones who thought they were prepared. Think about the world today. The collapse of faith in media, the rise of independent voices, citizens no longer believing official statements until they've been examined, debated, torn apart by millions on digital platforms, conspiracy theories merging with real disclosures, truth blending with misinformation until the line becomes too blurred to see clearly. This is exactly the fog she warned about, a moment when truths and lies swirl together like smoke, making clarity nearly impossible. And right at the center of this revelation, she placed the man of gold not as a prophet, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a catalyst, a figure whose presence forces the illusions to crack. She did not say he would reveal the truth. She said his existence would cause the truth to surface. Because a system built on choreography, on predictable players, predictable narratives, predictable power cannot maintain its balance when confronted with someone who moves outside the script. She warned that his second rise would ignite betrayals, people from his own side turning against him, allies becoming enemies, confidants becoming accusers, and we have seen it begin already. Voices once loyal, stepping forward with testimony sharp as blades, party lines blurring under the weight of personal ambition, a political world tearing itself apart from the inside. But this was still not the full revelation, not yet. She said the revelation would divide the nation into two Americas, not north and south, not coastal and inland, but ideological nations sharing the same land. Two shadows of the same body, she said. One would pursue control, surveillance, centralized authority, order through obedience. The other would reject the systems entirely, seeking independence, self-sufficiency, spiritual revival, and truth outside institutions. It wouldn't begin with war. It would begin with rejection. States defying federal commands. Cities declaring independence in spirit, if not in law. Communities building parallel systems, financial, informational, educational. Citizens creating their own networks of trust outside the traditional structures. She said the divide would deepen until the nation would feel like two countries living side by side, neither willing to bend. And then she spoke of the eagle, the symbol of the United States folding its wings inward, a haunting image, a protector collapsing into itself, a nation turning its power against its own body. This was the moment, she said, would precede the Great Silence. The silence was not metaphorical, it was literal. She saw communication lines falter, broadcasts stopping one by one, screens turning black, information flowing only through whispers, radios, and physical contact. She spoke of a digital blackout so vast that the world would suddenly feel a century older, a moment when humanity would be forced to sit with its fears instead of drowning them in noise. Some interpret this as a spiritual quieting, but many believe she foresaw something more concrete, a cyber collapse triggered by geopolitical conflict, solar storms, or the sabotage of undersea cables that hold the modern world together. Imagine, for a moment, a nation already divided, already trembling, suddenly cut off from communication. Imagine decisions made in silence, panic blooming in crowded cities, rumors spreading faster than truth could move. She warned that this silence would separate people long before it unified them. She said that in the silence, two kinds of souls would emerge, those who panic and those who prepare, those who fear, and those who listen, those who search outward for rescue, and those who look inward for guidance. The voice within, she said, will be the last light. The great revelation does not end with the truth exposed. It ends with the world stripped of distraction, forced to confront itself in the absence of constant noise. And in that pause, she said, something else would rise. A figure she called the man of the red light. But before we walk into that final prophecy, pause for a moment. Ask yourself whether the divide you see today feels like a political disagreement or something deeper. Ask yourself whether the chaos in information feels random or part of a pattern trying to reveal itself. Ask yourself whether the thought of silence terrifies you or strangely feels like something the world might already be yearning for. Because if she was right, the silence is not the end. It is the doorway. She said that after the storms, after the fires, after the revelation and the silence, the world would not collapse, it would pause. A moment suspended between two eras, a breath held by history itself. And in that quiet threshold, she foresaw the emergence of a figure she called the man of the red light. The prophecy was cryptic, fragmented, whispered in riddles that even her closest followers struggled to decipher. But the images she described were vivid enough to haunt the imagination. She spoke of a tower illuminated in crimson, a symbol of power, governmental, financial, or spiritual, bathed in a red glow. She said when the red light touched this tower, the world would face a choice so sharp, so irreversible, that humanity would feel the weight of it for generations. Many have tried to interpret who this man might be. Some believe he is a political leader, emerging in the vacuum left by chaos. Others say he is an investigator, a whistleblower, an unseen force who brings truth not gently but like a blade. A few interpret him as a symbol, artificial intelligence illuminated by warning signals, glowing red when systems overload or when something too dangerous breaks free. But Vanga did not describe him as a hero or a villain. She described him as a catalyst, just like the man of gold, someone whose presence divides the world into two paths, someone who forces humanity to see what it has been unwilling to acknowledge. She said he would be misunderstood, feared by many, admired by others, and entirely unavoidable. And she warned that when he rises, the path will split in two. Think about the moment we stand in now. Technology accelerating faster than ethics. Power structures trembling. Secrets surfacing. Nations polarizing. Truth and lies tangled so tightly that even the wisest among us can lose their way. The red light could be a warning and alarm sounding across systems, governments, and societies. Or it could be a person, someone embodying the shock and illumination of that warning. Yet for all the darkness in her visions, Baba Vanga did not end her prophecy in despair. She said something profound, something almost tender, that from the ashes of conflict, chaos, and revelation, a reborn America would rise, not a stronger government, not a new empire, but a new consciousness. She said the nation would rediscover something ancient and essential buried beneath politics and noise. People would awaken one by one, realizing that the systems they trusted were illusions, that the power they feared was only as real as the belief they gave it, and that unity could return not in the halls of government, but in the hearts of ordinary people choosing something different. She described small towns becoming the seeds of renewal, communities rebuilding with their own hands, their own shared truth, their own quiet wisdom. She saw networks of individuals connecting not through screens, but through spirit. She saw parallel systems rising, alternative economies, decentralized education, new forms of cooperation born not from ideology but from necessity. A spiritual reformation, not a political revolution. And she said the rebirth would not come with trumpets or declarations. It would come quietly, the way dawn touches the horizon before most people are awake. She warned, however, that not everyone would make this transition. The light will not save all, she said. Only those who see it. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth about perception, about awareness, about the difference between those who cling to collapsing illusions and those who let go in time to build anew. Then she spoke her final warning, the one that resonates louder now than ever. The greatest war of the future will not be fought with weapons, but with truth against deception. She said lies would become the most dangerous tool in the hands of the powerful. That illusions would be woven with such sophistication that people would follow false prophets, false saviors, false narratives, believing they had found clarity. And she said the only true defense would be the ability to see not with eyes, but with discernment. Look at the world now. Information traveling faster than thought, algorithms shaping belief. Entire populations guided not by truth, but by the most persuasive lies delivered with surgical precision. We are living in the battlefield, she described one, where the war is invisible, and the casualties are minds, not body. Yet despite all this, she ended with hope. A hope grounded not in systems, institutions, or leaders, but in human awakening. She said that once the lie collapses, even the smallest spark of truth can rebuild what the world thought it had lost forever. She said America would rise again not as the America of old, but as something wiser, more humble, more spiritually attuned. A nation no longer blinded by noise, no longer paralyzed by division, but steadied by a new understanding of itself. And in this reborn era, the man of gold and the man of the red light would no longer matter. What would matter is the choice people make when the noise falls away. The choice to see, the choice to awaken, the choice to rebuild, not from fear, but from clarity. As we step toward 2026, her final question lingers like a soft echo. When the moment comes, will you recognize the light? Because if her prophecies are unfolding around us, then the future she warned of is no longer distant. It is here, it is rising, it is whispering to those willing to listen. And perhaps the silence she spoke of has already begun. Now, as this journey closes, breathe once, let the noise fade, and remember her last words. The blind will lead the blind until one dares to see.